We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
It's the late 90s and Mahmood Fazal is growing up in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. His parents settled here after fleeing the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And for Mahmood, it's a calm and loving childhood. Weekends are spent with Dad at work in the Dandenong markets, and at home his mum cooks delicious delicacies to keep the memories of their homeland alive. They're a loving family and life in Australia is good. That is until 2001, when everything changes. Not just for Mahmood, but for all Afghans all around the world. Until now, no one knew much about their homeland. Now, it's a country everyone is aware of. Mahmood is just starting high school and kids are cruel. In a country he once felt at home, he is completely outed. 9/11 shakes his sense of belonging and changes life in Australia forever. This lack of belonging, the feeling of being an outsider, will lead him to become deeply embedded in one of Australia's most violent gangs. I'm at Middleton and this is Headgame. Today, how Mahmood Fazal became a sergeant-at-arms for the Mongols bikie gang and the lessons in resilience, reinvention and redemption. Mahmood Fazal, thank you so much for coming on my podcast, Headgame. Now, you've got quite a fascinating story. Where were you born, Mahmood?
I was born here in Melbourne in the southeast in 1990. So my parents moved here from Afghanistan. They fled the Soviet invasion. And my father's uncle sponsored him to come over here roughly around 88. And 2 years later, I arrived here, man.
2 years later, you were born, Mahmood. And what was your household like? What was it? Was it quite Australian, or were you still quite traditional with your Afghan roots and the ways of the Middle East, shall we say?
Yeah, well, my parents were definitely still trying to figure out this land in which they'd arrived, and they spoke Pashto at home. I grew up in an Afghan household that was very much time locked to Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was quite, unique in that it was conservative, but there were quite progressive elements of the country as well. Women were going to university. There was American records you could readily access. There was a big music culture and a big poetry culture. So I grew up in a household that very much celebrated their kind of Afghan heritage, and Pashto was my first language. But then otherwise, I was very much encouraged to be, an Australian. My parents were barracked for the Australian cricket team. We were very much part of this culture, and very much my parents encouraged me to be as Australian as I could be. And I was welcomed at school and in primary school and in my community as an Australian until 9/11 pretty much.
So did you see yourself as Australian or did you see yourself as Afghani?
There wasn't really a confusion. I think I merged the two together, and I very much felt Australian and Afghan at the same time. And at school, I remember, kids being kind of fascinated by this exotic kind of strange place that no one had heard of back then, particularly in suburban, working class suburban Melbourne, this place Afghanistan. It was just kind of like a tongue twister that they would, joke about in the schoolyard, but no one actually knew where this strange place was. I never felt like an outsider, really. I was definitely one of the boys on the schoolyard, and very much part of the community and very much an Australian. I didn't really know what it meant to be an Afghan outside of my home. there wasn't much of an Afghan community back then either. So my experience of Afghanistan was very limited to my specific household. I think back then our community was only like 100 people in the whole of Victoria. So, and a lot of them were family members.
So primary school, you mentioned primary school. Was that quite a comfortable living, quite a good way of living? You were very sort of integrated, you loved it, and you mentioned there that things changed after. Obviously 9/11, huge event, global event that happened. But just talk me prior to that. Were you a fun-loving kid and just happy-go-lucky and loving life?
I was very much happy-go-lucky. You know, I listened to Powderfinger. I did all the things young Australian kids did. I was probably edging on being like a bogan. Like I was, I was into VLs. I was just... played cricket, wanted to be like Brett Lee, all that stuff. And then, around grade 5, things started shifting. You know, I had a bit of a traumatic event that happened in grade 5. And then the following year was 9/11, when I was in grade 6. And there was this real shift where I felt like I was this part of the community, but from a strange land, but I was one of the boys, to suddenly everyone feeling as though they actually knew the real me. You know, they began to understand what Afghanistan was and who the people from Afghanistan were and what they represented and what they really wanted to do to the West. Well, that was how I felt. You know, I felt like I'd kind of been stained with this brush that, the media kind of propelled.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. So it was a knock-on of effects, really, from grade 5, and then grade 6, 9/11 happens. Do you remember that day?
I remember the morning quite vividly, like seeing my father on the couch, kind of watching the planes flying over and over again, juxtaposed with these images of bearded men in these caves, and then the mountains of Afghanistan, like just over and over and over again. And my dad kind of seemed worried. I think it was one of the only times I'd really seen my dad kind of concerned and worried, which was odd. I knew something weird was going on. And then I remember being at school, and there was this kind of strange panic. Even in the classroom, everyone seemed confused, and we're talking about it, and we were like 11 years old, so it's kind of weird. But the teachers were obviously concerned, and the kids were talking about it. And I remember one of the girls looking over at me and saying, "Isn't that where you're from?" And said, "Yeah," and it was this really profound moment where I suddenly realized that I wasn't part of the group. I might belong to something else, and I kind of had to understand that and learn about that and reckon with what that meant.
So when that happened, did you no longer sort of see yourself as Australian? Did it flip straight over to, right, people are looking at me now, looking at my home country, this event has just happened? Did you sort of go back into your Afghanistan heritage because obviously you were, pushed into that way, or was it a conscious decision of, wow, this is happening in my homeland?
Well, the following year, 9/11 happened in September, obviously, and then the following year was my first year of high school. So there's already all this flood of emotions, and you're trying to reckon with all of that stuff, and suddenly you go from being the oldest kid in the schoolyard to the youngest kid in the schoolyard. Yeah. And there was this odd thing where all these people that you grew up with, that you had relationships with, suddenly didn't want to hang out with you and associate with you in the high school yard. And so you gravitate towards the handful of other kids that kind of get you. And I was lucky enough, I had a couple of cousins at the school that I went to, and we just kind of clicked together, and it was like...
Did you feel like that you had to click together? Did you feel like that you were pushed towards that, and you naturally gravitated towards that because of the situation?
I think it was obvious that we felt excluded.
Got you. It was an obvious exclusion.
Yeah, and there was, a lot of schoolyard jokes around, terrorists and, and when you're young and you're naive, you kind of play along with all that stuff because you want to be accepted, and so, but then, there was a few very stern conversations, I had with my cousins where we decided we're not going to cop it anymore. Like I said, there was maybe 4 or 5 of us. Even some of the Arabs that were hanging out with us, they were like Christian Palestinian kids. Like they were Christians, but they still got,
they still
got excluded too.
The brunt of it, yeah.
Yeah, they were still seen as kind of these terrorist Middle Eastern kids, these terrorist Arabs. It wasn't just us, but there was maybe 5 or 6 of us that just stuck together and. Very early, maybe halfway through that first year, one of my cousins was at the school. She used to wear a hijab, and she got I remember she got like an orange pegged at her head, and the white hijab, there was just bits of orange all over it. And it was a kind of breaking point where my cousin was a lot more aggressive than I was. And he said, I'm not copping that anymore. And this was a much older kid too that did it. He was in year 11 or something, or year 12. And it was, we went to his locker bay and we just...
So you pushed a breaking point, really?
Yeah. And we, pretty much. I mean, we knew that if we don't do anything, we're just going to keep copping this for the rest of our lives in high school. Yeah. And
absolutely.
so then when we did that, people started respecting us. It really confused us because we used violence in a very aggressive way, and we got respect for it, and people didn't fuck with us. And so in our very young minds, we thought, well, that's the answer, and then perhaps...
it works, right? It's like, it works, we're getting respect. Was there a mindset shift there as well, Mahmood? Was there a mindset shift of, actually, you've pushed me out, fuck you lot, we're going to stick together, it's us against you? Was it divisive like that, or was it just a case
of...
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
and how did that make you feel?
Angry, yeah. We were very angry. We felt betrayed by the people that we loved, and the community that we loved that estranged us. And so we suddenly, I remember borrowing books about Afghanistan from the school library, like literally having to learn, because my parents were, like, my dad was kind of illiterate, he never went to school and stuff. So we couldn't mine him for the history of our country. Everything he knew was kind of third or fourth hand. And so I just remember literally trying to learn about who I was in these strange texts at the school library, and suddenly having to face the fact that, I'm never going to be seen as an Aussie. None of these kids will ever believe that I'm an Aussie, so I've got to actually figure out who the fuck I am in this strange environment.
Did you try and say, I was born here, I'm just as Australian as you are? And was there a fight with that? Did you lose the will to fight that fight? Or was it just a case of the segregation was too obvious, it divided, you stick to your group, they stick to their group, and we need to stick together?
I think everyone's mind at that point was already made up that, it really is a war of us against them, the West against these people in the Middle East. And if, you believe in any of the things that these people in the Middle East believe, you're not part of us. And we were Muslims, so it was, we very much believed that, we probably are not part of this group anymore. And so it was very confusing. And we definitely had to basically seek out a new identity or construct a new identity. And it was very much, it was very disorientating. But it was also, the main problem was that we began to use violence that got results, and then that kind of intoxicated us further. And it was just a kind of slippery slope that made us make a lot of bad decisions.
And what path of destruction, if it was a path of destruction or violence, did that lead you down from that moment onwards?
Well, we kind of shifted into in the beginning it was reactionary. We thought, if these people are picking on us, so we're going to get them back. But then we just started, we thought, well, actually, let's address the problem before it starts, and just started, almost like terrorizing the other kids on the schoolyard, and just being really awful people. But it was it protected us, and it was a very early lesson in that. I began to learn that sometimes the most aggressive and violent and unpredictable people are often the most scared and the most vulnerable, and that's why they lash out the way they do. And so, that's what happened. And then we started, meeting other kids from other neighborhoods that were the same as us. And then we just started hustling and, getting up to no good and clicking up with other kids who also viewed themselves as outsiders and were forming little groups. And then we'd all hang out after school and, it kind of erupted out of the school environment onto the streets, and wow. That's how it happens when you're young. You're not going to go to school. You don't feel like the system is playing in your favor, and so you're going to do what all the other kids on the street are doing, who also feel rejected and neglected by that system. So you start falling off.
And did you start to sort of completely push away your Australian identity?
Yeah, I was just angry.
Yeah.
I was just like angry at it because I was like, overnight, you feel like you've made all the sacrifices to assimilate and to integrate into this culture, for it all to be thrown away at the drop of a hat. I was just furious. And then there was this kind of campaign in the media, or what felt like to us as a campaign, where there's all these stories on the front page of the tabloid press about young, violent, most of the time Muslim men, and it constructed this kind of image in the zeitgeist about who we were and what we represented. So you had the scaff rape trials, you had the people smugglers, you had the Cronulla riots, you had the Iraq war, you had these guys, the Taliban, you had ISIS, you had all of these images that weren't, there was no other media representation that kind of balanced the books, really. The only time you saw young Middle Eastern men on screen, they were up to no good, and
of course, it done you no favours. And also, you sort of play up to that, don't you? Especially when you're young and you're naive, and you said it spilled out onto the streets. How? What do you mean when you say it spilled out onto the streets?
Yeah, I mean, like back then when you're young and you're just like drinking with your mates and smoking with your mates after school, you don't sit down together and call yourselves a gang and like start,
of course not.
Like making T-shirts and stuff. You just hanging around. But back then it was all like it revolved around your neighbourhoods, kind of like there's the whole postcode thing now. Back in suburban Melbourne, it all gravitated around like train stations, because kids would hang out at train stations and they could be mobile or through train stations and go different ways. So each train station kind of had its own little crew of people that would hang around.
It was, because it's postcodes now, isn't it? So it's train. That's interesting.
So people would, like, if you had drama with someone else, and you always had drama with someone from a different kind of train station, and you'd get on the trains and run to go through their train station, and they'd do the same. So that's kind of what the culture was like in Melbourne. And they were like, when kids started going to juvie and kids are getting stabbed all of a sudden, and then, people are moving pills and people are smoking weed and selling weed, and there's like you start hearing about the older boys, and then they become like these mythic kind of war heroes that have, done stints in jail, they're driving, AMGs, and that's when it really
it's glorified. Everything's glorified, isn't it? And like you say, you almost want to uphold that reputation, and do your team proud, shall we say?
Yeah, but it goes back to this other thing where there were no other positive role models back then to counterbalance that. So in the neighborhoods that we were kicking it at, the only people who looked like they had money and were successful were drug dealers. Mm-hmm. That's all there was. Like they were. Everybody knew they were drug dealers. They might have had a panel beating shop. They might have had a little, a little
front somewhere.
Yeah, a little, a pizza shop where they would wash their money, but they were all drug dealers. And so when you grow up in an environment like that, you think, well, the only way out for me is to do what these guys are doing. And so...
make my money.
Yeah.
And then, away we go.
Yeah, and so my parents could see that I was really, falling off the track here and getting up to no good. And, I got arrested a couple of times, and, my parents finding weapons on me and weapons in my room and stuff like that. And they knew that it was getting really wild. So they sent me off to like a posh school,
When did you know that it was getting really wild?
I didn't really have that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I can see it in hindsight, but at the time it wasn't like this awakening inside me that motivated me and inspired me to do better. It wasn't. But yeah, one of my best friends, there was like these kinds of career. They're kind of like these big events where all these different high schools go to, and the universities present like career prospects and they kind of
career-driven sort of pitches,
like career opportunities and like pathways to different universities and stuff like that. And one of my best mates got into it with guys from a different area, and ended up, stabbing up a couple of people at this kind of high school event thing, and he got locked up and went away for a couple of years. So that was one of the real kind of pivotal moments in my childhood where I thought, oh, it's getting, pretty serious. Like he could have killed those kids or whatever. And ironically, the kids he stabbed were Afghans. So they were Hazara kids who just come in the second wave. So there was another wave of Afghans in Melbourne that came after the invasion. So, but yeah, and so my parents wanted to get me away from the environment that I was in, and they did that by putting me in school, and suddenly I lost contact with, and my mate went to jail and juvie, and so suddenly I was kind of in this new environment, and yeah.
Wow. And so your parents are seeing this fall of grace, shall we say. Are they super concerned for you? Do they pull you aside at any point? And is there a moment where, they pull you to one side and says, this has to stop, you have to?
Oh yeah, many times. But you kind of don't. It's hard to explain because that there's that duality, like you mentioned, that there's the person you are at home and then there's the person you are outside, and you feel like they're two split personalities, like they're two different people. And when they start pulling you up on who you are on the outside, you kind of get mad at them because you're like, you don't know what it's like for me, in a very fucking teenage angsty way, like you don't know what it's like for me. But they really didn't. They really believed in the Australian dream that, this is a meritocracy, and, it's not, you're fucking up is, it's because you're fucking up. You've got every opportunity here. They came from Kandahar, from the farms in rural Kandahar. You know what I mean? They thought, we've got every opportunity here. Why are you throwing it away? And there was all this kind of complex socio-political stuff swirling around us that they couldn't comprehend, and neither could we. But yeah, I think we knew that they couldn't understand something that was happening to us, and so every time they pulled us up, we were just like, fucking get it.
Eventually, were you part of a biker gang as well?
Yeah, so that happened after. So I went to school, and when I went to that posh school, I went to art school. I really was inspired to read. I had a few very influential teachers at that school that really inspired me to find or reconfigure my moral compass through actually reading, and I became quite a voracious and obsessive reader. And then I went to art school, got out of art school and couldn't get a job and stuff. And then I found myself back at square one. So I was waxing with those same kids that I grew up with. And one thing led to another, except that they hadn't had that moment where they left and came back. They had just graduated on and on to bigger and bigger things on the streets. And so by the time I linked up with them after art school, they were all already kind of making big moves in the suburbs, and they had big runs, and they were pretty serious. And when
you say making big moves, obviously there's a ranking system within these organisations. Were they making their way up the ranks, earning more money? Was that the case there? And you thought, right, bang, jump back in.
They were just like looking out for me because they could see that I didn't have any money or anything like that, and I didn't have a job, and no one was hiring people that looked like us back then with names like Mahmood, and so they were just like chopping me in to what they were doing, and I guess I started helping them. Like I brought. And I kind of helped them strategize and helped them think of new ways of applying new kind of business models, or applying new kind of logistical strategies in what they were already doing, because I could offer them a fresh way of thinking about crime, organized crime. And I was very resourceful, and so I very quickly was noticed by specific people back then, and I climbed the ranks very quickly. And then, there was a guy in prison who was kind of a father figure to the Muslims in jail. He was very influential, and he was being patched into an outlaw motorcycle club, and I was part of a group of people that were representing him on the outside, and then we went to the outlaw motorcycle club and eventually became members.
Wow. And this, when you became members, was it a mixture of all religions, or was it just Muslims, or what? How did that work?
No, it was back then it was a club called the Finks, but then it patched into another international motorcycle club called the Mongols.
Well known.
Yeah, but back it was outlaw motorcycle culture is unique, and as you would probably know, it was born out of returning Vietnam vets who felt ostracized by their communities, who banded together and found that adrenaline rush, or found that freedom and a place to express themselves in these kind of subcultures, and they formed these brotherhoods, and they were all mixed, they were people from different backgrounds that just felt like outsiders that were literally blood related by the colors of their vests and by the patches that they wear, and it's kind of like you wear an oath to belong to each other. And so it was refreshing to see that this is another group that is also that gets what's happened to us and understands, and that they'll accept us because they are in the same vein of that, outsider culture or counterculture or whatever.
And was there Australians in this bike organisation?
Yeah, definitely. Probably majority were Australians. I mean, the Finks was a very kind of Anglo-Australian club that originated in Adelaide. So there definitely was the heritage of that old white traditional classic outlaw biker, big bearded, kind of tatted up.
Yeah,
a lot of Nazi kind of symbolism in the air. There was a lot of that stuff going on, but by the time we got involved, there was a shift in outlaw motorcycle culture in Australia where different clubs were vying for power by basically recruiting people who were influential on the streets. And the people at that time who were influential on the streets were all from different backgrounds, and majority of them Middle Easterners, mainly in Sydney and then in Melbourne. And I think a lot of that has got to do with a lot of these problems in which, after 9/11 and after all that stuff, the kids began running amok on the street. Some of them did very well, and built really hectic reputations for themselves, and then they got kind of drafted by these clubs.
What was that bikey life like?
I mean, it can be whatever you want to make it. It is very much a club that is full of people who really are diehard motorcycle enthusiasts that love the culture. And I'm just a disclaimer here is that, you know, I'm talking about a club 7 or 8 years ago, you know. There's
of course.
And I'm talking about a very specific chapter of a club that's not, you know, I'm not saying like this is how every club in Australia works, and I don't know how clubs work now even. So I'm just giving my own personal perspective
your
from
personal
that time.
view.
Yeah. And so, yeah, back then there was people who were diehard motorcycle enthusiasts. There were people who were obviously traumatized. There were people who felt lonely, and there was you know, drug dealers. There were thugs. There was a bit of everyone because it was a place that accepted you no matter what your background was.
Hence the title Outlaws, right? It's of course.
It was just whatever corner of the world you came from, you could be accepted as long as you subscribed to this code and to this brand or whatever. And so it wasn't like Sons of Anarchy where people sit around at a table and you've got the fucking president telling everyone like you got to move these guns from Sydney to, you know,
Melbourne,
the Northern Territory, and, you know, what are the Sinaloans up to this weekend, and, you know, like there's nothing that doesn't exist. I mean, I'm sure it does exist, but it doesn't exist in that way. Everything is very much on a need to know basis, and if you want to do something and there's people at that club that can assist you in doing so, you might get up to something like that, but there's no way the entire club would know. It'd kind of be the same way as if you were in a football club, you know, and you knew a couple of people at your footy club that, you know, do a few things and you start connecting the dots, you know. The only difference is because you're in this environment that attracts people from all walks of life, their connections are far deeper and potentially wilder than, you know, the boys you meet at your footy club. And so you potentially get up to a lot graver,
a lot deeper and
a lot deeper
stuff.
things. Yeah.
And how desensitized at this stage in your life, so, you know, you've been patched in, you're living that full outlaw life, how desensitized to violence and drugs and to normal life are you?
Yeah, I guess I don't actually know how you could be desensitized to violence. I mean, you would probably be a better person to answer that question than I would. I mean, for me, every time I saw violence, it was shocking. You know, I never got really used to it, and it's always, you know, odd, and it's not as you would imagine it to be, and it unfolds in a very grotesque and brutal way, and it's always a little bit different, you know, like the way people fall, you know, the way people bleed out. Sometimes they don't bleed, you know, so, you know, what knocks people out, the way they have fits on the ground, and some people, you know, just get back up and don't remember what they were doing. You know, it's always very odd, and
it's always different, isn't it? It's like you said, you know, just how people fall, how people react, how people, you know, it's not like it is in the movies.
No, and the sounds are all so very different. Yeah, because you're hardwired to think it's going to be like the movies, but then when you see it and you see how cold it is and the way that, you know, when it happens, you expect someone to intervene or something, and then they don't. And it's suddenly, like, one of the craziest things I remember hearing from someone who committed, you know, had been in prison for murder. And I remember hearing this thing that they said that the scariest thing was, like, they woke up the next day and they were the same person. You know, like they were just doing the same shit. Like they were just going to the coffee shop, and that was the, like, they expected for something to happen, and it didn't.
When did you think, you know, enough is enough, and how did that happen?
For me, it was like a cumulative effect, and I will say, like, again, just say that I know people might be listening to this and say, you know, Australia's not that, you know, it's not that dangerous, it's not that, you know, scary. I mean, it's not Chicago, it's not Kandahar, but I think you have to really imagine crime around the world as a kind of bell curve in different countries, and, you know, at the top end, when you're at the deepest and at the deepest levels, it's as bad as it is everywhere else in the world. If you fuck up, you're going to get shot.
Agreed.
You're going to get killed. Like, that's just the way it is. So overall,
the code
that middle
almost remains the same, doesn't it?
Yeah. That middle, of course, Melbourne's not a crazy violent place in that middle section of the bell curve, but at the end, it's the same everywhere else. It's the same as any other country. You rob the wrong person, the one person gets paranoid thinking you're going to knock them, they're going to come after you. Like, and there's, these people do not count to 10. It's, they're going to do you. And so there was like a cumulative effect where in the space of maybe 2 or 3 years, it was probably 5 or 6 people that I knew intimately were killed. And, I couldn't handle that. I've met commandos and SAS guys and stuff like that, and I mean, they didn't even lose 5 of their mates in 1 or 2 years. Like, they lost a lot of mates, but it really messes with your head, and you hit a point where you're like, one of my best friends was mishandling a firearm, and I had to bury him. Like, he was, and then you're standing over this grave. And they're lowering the coffin and you're throwing dirt on it and you're thinking, what the fuck is this about? What is this about? Like, we're in our 20s. Like, why have I been to so many of these funerals? Like, what are we doing? And what is this thing that we're kind of enchanted by or spellbound by or obsessed with? And it revealed itself to me that this is all just smoke and mirrors. Like, this code doesn't exist. Like, nobody actually believes. Yeah, nobody believes in that shit. Like, it's just the crash dummies that believe in it. Like, that there's honor among thieves, that all this stuff, never talk to police, you do your time and all this stuff. And then you find out they're all talking to police. The people that are, chatting, saying, "Oh, I wouldn't cop that. I wouldn't," when you've been slighted or someone's wronged you, they're trying to motivate you to do something. They say, "I wouldn't cop that." Fucking course you would cop that. You cop whatever we tell you to do, you would cop that. And here you are telling this guy to do something, and then of course they do it and do 10 years in jail. And the bloke that was chirping away in his ears, not even there to visit him or put money in his bank account. You know what I mean? So it's like
get your head out your ass.
Yeah. And so, but that really damaged me, and I had to seek help. It all kind of crashed on me, and I had this moment of realization where I was like, I actually don't owe it to anyone to do anything in this. And I don't have to be part of this anymore. I don't. I can just stop. I don't have to be with these people. But I knew I had to make a radical move and actually cut contact. You can't be 1 foot in. Like, you have to be either in or out. Yeah, exactly. It's either you're in or you're out. And it was really cold because there was a lot of people I loved in that world that I had to cut ties with. And even those people, they're dead now. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, or they're doing really long bids in jail. Like,
and it's also one of those as well. It's not just change that's needed. It's drastic change. In a situation like that, it's got to be drastic. And when I mean drastic, to the point of maybe moving location, cutting off to everyone that's in that organisation or that's around. Even if you love them and if you're great friends with them, it's like, no, drastic change needs to happen in order for something good to come of it.
I got to the point where I was like, would you be happy being that young boy on that schoolyard, being bullied, having oranges thrown at your head or whatever? Fucking oath, I'd rather be that boy than do this shit and, drag my mates through hell. And
there's the Australian fucking oath.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, I would rather be that kid than, create these kind of cycles of destruction and, recidivism and like just dragging all my people, because it's my people that go down with me. It's not just me. Like, I'm dragging my cousins in. I'm dragging, like, if someone's got a drama with me, they're going to go to my family's house. They're going to do this. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's, I had to shoulder that and it was already too late. Like, I came to that realization way too late.
Yeah. And so you make this drastic change and it's quite the segue. How did that feel?
Yeah, well, initially I studied psychology and wanted to literally work as kind of a counsellor in prisons and to try and actually help rehabilitate people so that they don't go back to that life when they leave, because the recidivism rates are so high. And I thought that would be something purposeful that I could actually commit my life to. But then I met a bunch of editors and stuff through this friend of mine, and I began writing and got into journalism. And I actually thought, well, actually, no, it's about presenting this world for what it is, bare knuckles, and telling these young kids that it's not what's in the music videos and if your favorite rapper's music video. It's not, they're giving you, they're giving you the shallow veneer of the kind of porcelain veneer of what this lifestyle actually does. It's actually just, people robbing you, your mates robbing you, your mates telling on you. You can't trust anyone. People are going to get you. You're going to get bashed. You're going to get shot, and you're on your own. So you're better off on your own, just actually partaking in life and contributing to society rather than being another statistic, which is a cliche. But, if it's a double-sided coin and the option is, being in the streets forever or choosing life, I know what I'm going to be doing. I'm choosing life.
Every single time. Now that you do all this, how interesting is it to be an investigative journalist? And if anyone can tell that story and get in and show people, actually, this is how bad it is, and do not get involved. It's you.
Well, it was two things. It was that, but it was also about showing the public that these people that you're reading about are not just they're not just the criminals that they're made out to be. They've lived whole lives, and there's a lot of decisions that led up to that they made throughout their life, and a lot of kind of social fractures around them that led to their decision making that made them commit the crime. Like, my whole thing was, don't understand and trying to illustrate the criminal by the crime that they've committed. Try to understand them for everything that they've done up until the point that's led them to the crime. And it was really about empathizing with people, not sanitizing what they've done. And so I felt like, again, like I go back to like media representation and the way that people are perceived. I think what I really wanted to do was I felt like crime reporters had been captured by police narratives because they were relying on police because criminals wouldn't talk to them. And the one thing that I could do is actually get some criminals to talk and actually explain the rationale, and that things are a lot more complex than they're led to believe. And so that's what it is as well. The things are a lot more complex than what the media portray and what the media put out there. Well, you would know this firsthand. Mm-hmm. You experienced it, man. Yeah. Like you had all those reports written about you. Yeah. And you didn't have an opportunity, or you do have an opportunity now. But think about all the other people. You don't really, though, do you? Because you don't. You do, but it's only because I'm persistent like yourself at really, getting the message out there and educating people in that way. But it's hard. It is hard to, once the media portray you a certain way, or and like you said, the complexity of what actually happens underneath. People swallow that stuff up, don't they? They go, boom, they brand you with it, and like you said, they tar you with that brush, and all of a sudden, and sometimes I'm similar. Sometimes I think, well, I might as well just be that person, even though I'm not that person. Exactly. I might as well just be it. But again, and that's why it's dangerous. Yeah, that's why that reporting is dangerous. Mm-hmm. It's not actually just theory. Like, we're not actually talking about things in theory. This has real life consequences. I've seen people shoot each other over stuff they read in the papers that wasn't necessarily true. Yeah, and also take their lives. I've known people in the UK that have taken their lives because they've been tarnished. Trial by media. Nothing formal or nothing legal has come out of it, but it's just trial by media. They've read a bit of paper. All of a sudden, the whole world's against you, and it's too much for people. It's too much. You have this crazy thing in Australia where journalists are crying about defamation laws, and I agree. Defamation laws might be slightly lenient to super powerful people. But what they never fucking talk about is all of the people who don't have access to litigation and lawyers that they can talk about hook, line and sinker, and who never get an opportunity. Those working class people, the crooks, the criminals, people who have been wrongly accused, they can't afford $50,000 a day in litigation. So they just have to swallow this image that's being portrayed
this
about
one-sided image, because
Exactly.
they haven't got the facilities or the know-how to tell their side, or at least to get it out to the masses.
And sometimes it's just the charge. They don't even follow it up to sentencing. So you have someone who's been charged with an offence who gets front page treatment, and then he beats the charges in sentencing and he gets nothing. Mm-hmm. So
it's
and
are you working towards that? Are you? Is that one of your? Is that what did you say?
That's my ambition.
That's one of your main motivations in why you do what you do now.
Definitely, I think that's what inspires me, is to kind of I think the thing that I can contribute is to reimagine crime reporting, and in doing so, I mean, this is very idealistic, but in doing so, maybe it changes the public perception, and maybe it influences policy, and they reframe the way that they look at punishing people rather than actually rehabilitating them and trying to figure out what the kind of social issues are that are inspiring these crimes, rather than, just locking people up. Like, why are kids joining outlaw motorcycle groups? Why are these outlaw motorcycle groups, where are they coming from in society? What's actually generating these kinds of organised syndicates?
Why are youngsters being drawn to it?
Yeah. And how can we think about those issues and disentangle that and kind of put measures in place that move kids away from that? I think that's the most interesting thing, and the most if I'm balancing the books, it's the thing that I hope to contribute in some idealistic social justice warrior kind of fashion.
That you certainly know, mate. And adjusting to such a different way of life, how has that been?
In that world, I was a somebody, and then you kind of are a nobody, and you feel you have to adjust around the way that people can disrespect you, or things that you perceive to be disrespect. You just kind of have to wear all that kind of stuff, and that takes a bit of adjusting to. And obviously, you're making a certain amount of money, you're partying, you're having fun, you feel like a rock star, or you're imitating this kind of rock star lifestyle that's actually, like you said, it's actually just a mask that's hiding all this other stuff that you're dealing with inside your head. But sometimes you miss all that. But I would never have it any other way. I'm so happy for where I'm at in my life right now, and I feel good every morning. I wake up and I don't have to look behind my shoulder. I can go to any restaurant or any bar or any club that I want to go to without thinking, oh man, is it going to get a bit tense here? Who's going to be? Do you know what I mean? I don't have to worry about those anxieties. Yeah. You don't have to second guess. The police are tapping my phone, all this sort of stuff. The bugs in my car, all of this stuff. You can just be free. You can just do your bit and be happy, and look after the ones that will be there for you till the end.
And have you re-established or refound your identity? Who is Mahmood?
I think it's like this, because of what might have happened, what happened to me when I was young. I think I'm just constantly reconstructing and diverting and, becoming this different person. And I think that's a way that helps me deal with who I was in the past and kind of suppress that in some way. I haven't reverted back to any identity. I think I'm just constantly constructing new identities and kind of distracting myself with lots of work and trying to contribute in the most positive way.
And going back to head game, final question for you, Mahmood. What has your experience taught you about resilience?
I think you just have to back yourself in. I think that's all it's taught me, is always like believing in yourself and knowing that no matter how much noise there is, you can always, the decision's always yours, and you can just walk away. I think that's the most powerful thing for me in terms of resilience, is that you are the owner of your decisions, and no matter how much noise there is and how much bullshit there is out there of people saying you have to do this, you actually don't have to do nothing. You just be yourself and make your own decisions, and that's that. And that's it, No, I've done that, and it's worked for me.
Mate, I've loved this conversation. Loads of common ground, loads in common from two people that had two completely separate careers. Yeah, it's been fascinating, mate. Thank you for coming on.
Respect.
You're a gentleman, mate. Keep doing what you're doing. Thanks so much for joining me on Headgame. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories. And leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Ant Middleton. Catch you again next time.